Hello, everyone. Welcome, and a big warm hello from Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States. So today I'm going to be talking to you a bit about fusing facts and feelings to motivate action on climate change. Some of my work actually focuses on two big challenges. How do we understand how to stabilize carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere to limit warming? And given we are going to most likely fail on the first, we need to also, at the same time, adapt to climate change impacts to limit welfare loss. So what is going on with climate change? We've already warmed our planet by 1 degree, and we're on a current track or trajectory to warm our planet by 2.7 to 3.1 degrees Celsius. What does that mean in terms of a thermometer? This is where we are in terms of warming. And in terms of where we're headed, we're going to have a very, very different planet that we're going to have to deal with. So some of the areas that we actually consume energy are the top sources for global greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at this graphic, the top area is energy, where you use energy in our industry, transportation, energy in buildings, so on and so forth, followed by agriculture, forestry, and land use, then industry, and then waste. So if we want to solve the climate problem, we really need to focus on decreasing our fossil fuel use in the energy sector. So some of my work actually focuses on how do we do that. But what I want to start with is my opinion, which is changing individual behavior is nowhere sufficient to address the problem, but individuals are vital to mobilize system-wide changes, from demanding and accepting decarbonization policies to transforming consumption behaviors. So we are needed in order to solve the problem, but we need huge shifts when it comes to our energy sector. And so today I would like to talk to you about some of my work and our lab's work looking at both information, which is what do people understand about the problem, and how do we sufficiently motivate people when it comes to climate change. I'll be talking to you about a variety of papers, and I won't be going through all of the details because there are too many. So if you want the details, all of these papers and the data for them is available on our website. But these are some of the ideas that we'll be talking about. Everything from individual perceptions of how much energy we use in our day-to-day lives, all the way to thinking about what do people want from the future energy system, or how do people understand what they want from the future energy system. So starting off, some of my initial PhD work focused on, hey, when you ask people, what is the single most effective thing you can do to conserve energy in your life? A lot of people are actually mistaken. So the top answer was turning off the lights, roughly by 20% of our participants. And all of these participants are from the United States, all the way to there's just no way, I don't know how to do it, or sleep more and relax more. So these are some interesting behaviors, and they're also challenges because turning off the lights, while it's a good thing to do, behaviors that are easiest to remember and perform, for example, turning off the lights, tend to have a minimal impact on climate change. So this is a sort of an incorrect heuristic or a cultural heuristic that we need to change. So what are some effective behaviors? Things like going with a plant-based diet, moving into electric transportation, living a car-free life, so on and so forth, having one fewer child. Those are effective behaviors identified by some of my colleagues. And so given that we have these huge challenges, some of my work has looked at, all right, do people understand as they go through their day-to-day lives how much energy different appliances take? So over here on the y-axis, you have people's perceptions of energy used, and on the x-axis, you have actual energy used or saved. Now, a lot of people don't know how much energy is a watt hour. So what we did in this work is said, all right, imagine a 100-watt light bulb being left on for an hour uses 100 units of energy. And then we asked participants about a variety of different devices in their home. And this is a log scale, so 10, 100, 1,000, so on and so forth. And what we found is that there's a significant underestimate at the high end, but let me walk you through some examples. So, for example, laptops on average are overestimated by a factor of 2. So people think it's actually equivalent to one light bulb when it's actually equivalent to half a light bulb. Alternatively, dishwashers are underestimated by a factor of 9. So people think it's actually equivalent to 2 light bulbs when it's actually equivalent to 18. And last but not least, for another example, is changing the washer setting on your clothes washer from hot to cold was underestimated by a factor of 40. So people think it's actually equivalent to 1 light bulb, when in reality it's equivalent to 40. So we have these significant underestimates when it comes to energy use, especially on the high end. So then the question for researchers is, how do we hold on to this curve and pull it up towards the diagonal? How do we get people to be better estimators of their own energy use? And one way that we've explored in our lab is providing an expert heuristic. So what we told our participants is large appliances that heat and cool use a lot more energy than people think. And what happens there is that we take this curve and we pull it up towards the diagonal because people use this heuristic when they're making these energy estimates. So heuristics are useful when it comes to energy estimation tasks. What we've also found is that when we interviewed roughly 30 energy experts, including electrical engineers, physicists, and energy analysts, we've started identifying and creating a library of expert energy heuristics. So some of these are shown here, and I'll just walk you through a couple of them. A greater temperature change requires more energy than a smaller temperature change. LED lights do not use that much energy, so on and so forth. So our experts are in fact much more accurate than our novices. So if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, a lot of the expert slopes are much steeper than our novice slope, which is much flatter. So that's good news. So the next stage of this area of research is really trying to understand what combinations of heuristics help people the most in trying to navigate this really complicated energy landscape. How long will these heuristics be remembered? And then can they replace less useful heuristics like turning off the lights? So that's something that we're working on actively today. Another area of work that was also recently published as of last year is when we wanted to understand. So now I've showed you sort of what do people think about their own energy use and energy in their home. But now the next step was looking at how do people think about the energy system in the United States. So we asked participants what they think is the current energy mix of the United States and what they hope it will look like in the year 2050. Now here, what we mean by energy mix is everything that's included in electric power, transportation, industry, commercial, and residential. So it's a variety of different energy sources that go into the energy mix for the United States. So on the next slide, what we see is this is the current energy mix for the United States. So we rely very heavily on fossil fuels, as you know. So the top energy source is oil, and that's primarily used for petroleum, for transportation, followed by natural gas, coal, then nuclear, biomass, hydro, wind, solar, and geothermal. So this is where we currently use our energy. And what you see here is our data from our study. So I'm going to walk you first through what people think are our current energy uses and what they want the energy mix to be in the future. So what's amazing, and we've separated out the data by conservatives, moderates, and liberals. So what we see is that there is a significant underestimation when it comes to oil, natural gas, and pretty large overestimates when it comes to wind, solar, geothermal, and hydro. And what's amazing in this data is that both conservatives, moderates, and liberals really want a future energy mix that is severely decarbonized. So there are these huge negative trends when it comes to what they want the world to look like in 2050, and really increasing trends for wind, solar, and geothermal for the 2050 mix. So that's really good news. But let's get into some more of the details. So when we asked our participants, all right, how much do you support or oppose a variety of decarbonization or anti-decarbonization policies, we do not see that similar convergence. As you can see from the top part of the slide, a lot of liberals more strongly support decarbonization policies across the board, except for nuclear, which is relatively flatlined. And for the anti-decarbonization policies, a lot of liberals more strongly oppose them. So even though there's this shared vision for what the future energy mix should look like, there's less convergence in terms of pathways of getting there. Another big challenge for our field in terms of behavioral science is that climate change is viewed as a futures problem. So here we asked participants, what is the most important problem for the United States today, the world today, the US in the future, and the world in the future? And what we find is that there's a lot of political ideology differences when it comes to climate change, where a lot of liberals think it's more important than conservatives. But not only that, most people think it's a futures problem rather than a problem that we're facing right now. And that's a misperception that we really need to break as a community. So, in terms of a summary for the work that I've shown you right now, is that both conservatives and liberals want a severely decarbonized future energy mix, a significant decrease in fossil fuel use, and a significant increase in solar and wind. But the tough news is that there are strong differences in the United States between liberals and conservatives in terms of how to get that future energy mix. So, with that, I wanted to sort of leave a little bit of open room for discussion in terms of how do we both bridge this growing gap between conservatives and liberals, and also how do we get people to change their behavior in a deeper way that's not just about their own individual behavior change, but also about thinking about social movements and also changing the system at large. And one area that I've been really curious about is sort of harnessing the power of narratives. Now, when I use the term narratives, it's anything that starts off with a story or an analogy or an image that can be very powerful for people in order to motivate them to action. I think stories are really powerful. I love stories, both fiction and nonfiction. I love to learn, so I think that they can be really powerful tools in terms of behavioral science to influence both behavior and people's motivations to sort of demand behavior changes. And so one thing that I've been really interested in, next slide please, is that, or this is a source of inspiration for me, is Richard Powers wrote this beautiful book called The Overstory, which is all about trees. And in the book, he states that the best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story. Following from that, I'd like to sort of pose a question to listeners right now is what stories have changed your thinking and behavior? How have they changed your behavior? So feel free to put that in the live chat and I'll try to go through that at the end of today. But I've been sort of going around asking people this question, trying to understand how have stories changed them? But it's a very difficult question to study experimentally. And so one image that I think is really powerful is the scene from Lord of the Rings. It's sort of, I call it the Balrog scene, where Gandalf is sort of facing this Balrog and he says, "You shall not pass." And sort of this theme of David and Goliath, we see that constantly throughout history. And I feel sometimes like that climate change is like this Balrog, that we need to sort of try to figure out how to sort of not let it come to being. And that's sort of a big question for where we are today. The reason I think facts and feelings are important is facts tell us what should I do with that problem. So the first part of my talk today really focused on people's misperceptions. So for example, we don't really understand very clearly how much energy different appliances use. We think that our current energy mix is more decarbonized than it really is. And these are challenges. So we need to know what to do about the problem and what is our call for action. And then the second bit is how do I feel about the situation and what is the intensity of my feeling? And I think that that is important too, because a lot of people think that climate change is a futures problem, that it's not a problem that we need to address today. And so we need to really figure out how to harness feelings in order to fuse feelings and facts to create effective and important change. And so there are lots of challenges with this new project that I'm working on, and that's why I wanted to spend more time talking about it. Deep narratives take time to influence behavior, making them hard to study experimentally. We need to move beyond marketing so that we're not selling a specific policy, but rather why we need climate policies. And we also need to bridge this growing partisanship when it comes to climate change beliefs, climate change actions, and why we need to address it right now. So in terms of a summary, today I've shown you that we need facts and feelings, information, motivation to foster useful change. We need to break down faulty heuristics and embed more useful heuristics in stories. I've also shown you today that some of our work experimentally shows that expert heuristics can improve people's judgments and decisions. Conservatives and the liberals share a vision for a decarbonized future energy system, but we do not share pathways of getting there. And so I would like to sort of end my talk today with this slide. So here are open ideas for our behavioral science community. We need facts and feelings and information and motivation to foster useful change. We need to empower individuals to change the larger system. So a lot of the work in our field, especially in the climate change arena, has said, all right, people do one or two things called the single action bias before they think that they've done their part, before moving on to the next problem that they face. So how do we keep people going? How do we, rather than sort of thinking about the single action bias, can we think about the avalanche effect, where I do one or two behaviors and then I want to be part of this movement where we demand a system-wide change? Rapid decarbonization and fast and effective adaptation need social sciences and social scientists to work with natural and physical scientists. And then finally, this is more for our field, we also need deep care and love for ourselves, because this is a really challenging problem. And this is something I tell my students as well, that there's a lot of climate grief and burnout. So every time you get burnout, leave, take care of yourself, put on your own air mask before you put it on for others. So thank you so much. Please share your ideas with me. And thanks so much for your attention.
Shahzeen, terrific. This is Chris Graves in Washington, D.C., and welcome to Nudgestock, our 9th and perhaps greatest and largest ever. So as you know well, being in the U.S., it's not about a conversion of people on a political point of view that's going to bring us together. It's really acting in their own self-interests. And I love that you pointed out the ineffectiveness of the easy things to do, because at scale, they don't matter. For example, would you assess one has been deemed to be one of the greatest global climate change events, Earth Hour, a total failure? Because all people do is turn their lights off for an hour and give themselves moral self-license that now they're sustainable.
So Chris, that's a really interesting question. So it depends, right? It depends whether people, by doing that action, they feel a deeper sense of connection with others. And that's just the entryway. That's just the doorstep. That's the first step for this many-step journey. Or whether they think that, all right, I've turned off my light, I've done my part for climate change, now let's move on with on this consumption treadmill. So I'm not sure about that. I think it can sort of go both ways, and we need to study that a little bit more closely. But I think just saying that Earth Hour is what we need to do is, of course, as you mentioned, not at all effective.
So on the front of, I work also in climate change communication for risk mitigation for folks like FEMA. And it's, of course, the most wicked of BS problems, because you've got every kind of cognitive bias to overcome. You mentioned how it's distant in every way, seemingly, even though it's here. So temporal discounting, for example, but there's also loss aversion. And when you use a term like decarbonization, it feels like you want to move us to an ascetic, monk-like existence where we're going to have to give up all the fun stuff. And in behavioral science, of course, Cass Sunstein said to us last year, for these tough behaviors, we need to make them fun and easy and attractive. So how do you make decarbonization sound more fun, easy, and attractive?
That's a great question. I think there are many ways, and I just want to be very clear. I've been accused of asking people to go live in the woods and make their own clothes and grow their own food, and that's not what I'm advocating for. I've never said that, nor have I ever told my students to do that. So I just want to put that on the side, because I've been accused in print for saying that, and that's not what I'm sort of imagining. I think that there's a lot that we can do. So, we've heard a lot today about sort of harnessing creativity, about sort of defrazzling and sort of deeper mindfulness. The idea of having solar power on our roofs actually help neighbors, or increase the chances of neighbors getting them. we sort of, as behavioral scientists, need to reimagine a future that's not so dystopic. And there are lots of, like, for example, in the solar punk, I'm a huge sci-fi nerd. So in the solar punk world, there are sort of these beginnings of sort of solving climate change through technology in a world that is really, that sort of I want to live in. And it's not sort of, again, making your own clothes. And I mean, I love people who can make their own clothes. I can't. So I think that that's where we harness our creativity and our imagination.
And yet we could probably get there collectively if it's something that is not politicizing. For example, food waste. Hard to politicize food waste. And yet we know from things like Drawdown Project, that's a colossal source of climate change bad effects. So is there perhaps a way, rather than individual actions where people are doing small, but perhaps effective at scale, in some cases not, a collective action on something that people don't feel would politicize them in individualist cultures like America? Things like food waste, rather than talking about the moralization of it, talk about the aversion to waste. Let's not waste things.
Sure. And there's been a lot of work in the framing literature that shows exactly what you're saying. So, Dave Hardesty, Elke Weber, and Eric Johnson have a paper called A Dirty Word or a Dirty World. And in that work, they basically say just framing something as environmental versus or green versus economical makes a huge difference when it comes to purchasing. And so there has been a lot of work that looks at that. I think food waste is great, but again, it's part of a portfolio. And remember, as I showed you on one of my slides, in the entire pie, we really need to decarbonize our energy system. And whether you call it decarbonizing, or whether you call, greening, or whether you call it, shifting, moving away from foreign sources of energy towards more national sources of energy, whatever that frame is, we need to figure that out like ASAP.
And there might be a crossover in cultures like America, where you look at something like the new Ford F-150 Lightning, which you would think the culture of F-150 pickup trucks is not very sort of sustainable or climate change minded. And yet, when it is this combination of raw power and speed, but electric, maybe there are areas where we can find common ground. So I'm glad you gave a
Sure.
shout out to Elke Weber, who spoke here last year with Eric Johnson. And Elke has also done work related to legacy and climate change. Priming people for their own legacy can have a positive impact. And for everybody who's watching, you might also look at the work of Paul Slovic, Lewandowski, Lowenstein, all the ones who have looked at communicating feelings as risk. Just as you have said, Shahzeen, it's not so cognitive, is it? It's really about our feelings. But with that, I want to thank you so much. And back to the studio.